55%. Remember that number, because it's the reason Europe's biggest economy is now collapsing. That's how much of Germany's natural gas came from Russia, right before Putin invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Imagine running a $1 trillion economy and losing half your energy overnight. Not a drill, not a hypothetical. This actually happened, and what's unfolding right now is a strategic catastrophe that took decades to build. Germany didn't stumble into this disaster. They engineered it themselves. Here's what makes this story absolutely fascinating. Germany didn't stumble into this crisis. They walked into it with their eyes wide open, ignoring warning after warning from allies, from neighboring countries, and even from their own experts. This isn't just about energy policy gone wrong. This is about how one of the world's most sophisticated economies made a series of calculated bets that all failed at once. And the consequences are reshaping not just Europe, but the entire global energy landscape. So let's talk about how we got here, because understanding Germany's energy crisis is critical to understanding what's happening in Europe right now. And trust me, it affects you too, even if you're sitting in your living room in Kansas or California. Germany used to be the envy of the world. In the 2000s and early 2010s, the German economy was absolutely crushing it. Strong growth, world-leading exports, a balanced budget. They were growing faster than the United Kingdom, faster than France. German engineering was the gold standard. Their manufacturing sector was the backbone of the European Union. And underneath all of that success was one critical ingredient: cheap Russian natural gas. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. This wasn't just a random business relationship. This was a deliberate strategic choice rooted in a German philosophy called Wandel durch Handel. That translates to change through trade. The idea was simple, almost elegant. If you do business with authoritarian regimes, if you create economic interdependence, you can encourage them toward democracy. Trade becomes a tool for peace. Economic ties prevent war. Think about that logic for a second. The Germans believed that by buying Russian gas, by building pipelines, by creating mutual economic dependency, they could moderate Putin's behavior. They could bring Russia into the fold of democratic nations through commerce. And you know what? For a while, it seemed to work. The gas flowed, Germany's economy boomed, and everyone made money. Russian gas was powering German factories, heating German homes, and fueling what they called the job wonder, the jobs miracle. Germany's golden decade of growth in the 2010s was literally built on Russian energy. But here's the kicker. While Germany was building this economic partnership, warnings were coming from everywhere. Poland was practically screaming about the dangers. The Baltic states, countries that had lived under Soviet occupation, were waving red flags. Even the United States was raising concerns. In 2018, President Trump told Angela Merkel that Germany was making itself totally controlled by and captive of Russia because of these energy ties. And Germany, they kept building. They didn't just maintain their dependency on Russian gas. They actually increased it. Let me paint you a picture of just how deep this went. In 2005, a guy named Gerhard Schröder was Chancellor of Germany. Just before he lost the election to Angela Merkel, he signed a joint declaration with Vladimir Putin for something called the Nord Stream pipeline. This was going to be a direct connection from Russia to Germany beneath the Baltic Sea, completely bypassing Ukraine, Poland, and the Baltic states. Here's where it gets wild. Immediately after stepping down as chancellor, Schröder joined the board of the Nord Stream consortium. The former leader of Germany went straight to work for a Russian pipeline project. If that sounds like a conflict of interest to you, well, a lot of people agreed. But the pipeline got built anyway. Nord Stream 1 came online in 2011. It could transport about 55 billion cubic meters of gas per year directly from Russia to Germany. And the Germans loved it. Reliable, cheap energy flowing directly into their economy with no transit countries to worry about. But wait, it gets better. Or worse, depending on how you look at it. They decided to build Nord Stream 2. This would double the capacity to over 100 billion cubic meters per year. Construction started in 2018 and finished in 2021. Now, remember when I mentioned those warnings? Ukraine's president called Nord Stream 2 a tragic historic mistake. Polish officials said it would empower Moscow to attack our common values. The United States imposed sanctions on companies involved in the project. President Biden said in February 2022, just days before the invasion, that if Russia attacked Ukraine, there will no longer be a Nord Stream 2. And here's what Germany did. They kept building. Angela Merkel defended the project. The German business community was all in. Energy companies, chemical manufacturers like BASF, they all stood solidly behind these controversial pipelines. From their perspective, and this is important to understand, this was just smart business. Russian gas was cheap. It was reliable. Russia had been a consistent supplier for decades. Why wouldn't you want to secure your energy supply at the lowest possible cost? From a purely economic standpoint, it made perfect sense. But from a strategic standpoint, that's where the blind spot comes in. Now let's add another layer to this story, because Germany wasn't just betting everything on Russian gas. At the exact same time, they were systematically shutting down their nuclear power plants. The anti-nuclear movement in Germany goes way back to the 1970s. After 3 Mile Island in 1979, after Chernobyl in 1986, German opposition to nuclear power became one of the founding principles of their Green Party. And that opposition ran deep in German society. In 2000, Germany passed its first law to phase out nuclear energy by 2022. They had 17 nuclear reactors generating over 33% of the country's electricity, and the plan was to shut them all down. Then in 2010, Chancellor Angela Merkel actually extended that deadline to 2036. She gave nuclear plants an average of 12 more years. Nuclear energy was going to be a bridge technology to help Germany transition to renewables. But then Fukushima happened. March 2011. A tsunami hits Japan, the Fukushima nuclear plant melts down, and Germany completely reverses course. Within 6 months, 8 nuclear reactors shut down. The rest were scheduled for progressive phase-out. And here's the timing that's crucial. Germany is phasing out nuclear power while simultaneously becoming more dependent on Russian gas. They're eliminating a carbon-free, reliable baseload power source and replacing it with natural gas as their bridge fuel to renewables. From the German perspective, this made sense too. The German people overwhelmingly opposed nuclear power. Polls consistently showed majority support for the phase-out. This was democracy in action. The Green Movement had built decades of grassroots support. Citizens didn't want nuclear waste in their country. They didn't want the risk of another Chernobyl. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Those nuclear plants were generating electricity with zero carbon emissions. When Germany shut down 4.3 gigawatts of nuclear capacity, they didn't replace it with renewables overnight. They replaced it with coal and natural gas. Studies show that if Germany had kept its nuclear plants running, their emissions reduction would have been up to 50 percentage points better. Instead of a 37% reduction in electricity-related emissions, they could have achieved an 88% reduction. And where did all that extra gas need come from? You guessed it. Russia. So by early 2022, Germany had painted itself into a corner. 55% of their gas supply came from Russia. They'd shut down their nuclear plants. Their renewable energy transition was moving slower than planned. German industry, one of the most energy-intensive in the world, was running on Russian gas. 28% of their gas went to industry, 44% went to heating buildings, and then Putin invaded Ukraine. On February 22, 2022, Germany suspended Nord Stream 2's certification. 2 days later, Russia launched its full-scale invasion. And suddenly, Germany faced an energy crisis unlike anything they'd experienced since World War II. Russia started cutting gas supplies. By August 31, 2021, Gazprom had halted delivery through Nord Stream 1 indefinitely, officially for maintenance needs. Then, on September 26, 2022, something extraordinary happened. 4 explosions ripped through the Nord Stream pipelines. 3 of the 4 lines were rendered inoperable. Gas poured into the Baltic Sea in what became the largest methane leak in human history. Somewhere between 100,000 and 400,000 tons released into the atmosphere. German investigations later concluded that a team of divers directed by Ukrainian officials was responsible for the sabotage. But by that point, it didn't matter who blew up the pipelines. Germany had already lost its Russian gas supply. The impact was immediate and devastating. Energy prices shot up 35% compared to pre-war levels. That might not sound like much, but remember, Germany is an industrial powerhouse. Energy costs drive everything from steelmaking to chemical production to automobile manufacturing. German industry started hemorrhaging. The Purchasing Managers' Index for manufacturing fell to 42.1, marking the 26th consecutive month of contraction. Energy-intensive businesses that had built their operations around cheap Russian gas suddenly couldn't compete. And here's where it gets personal for German citizens. Inflation hit 8% in 2022 and 7% in 2023. Electricity prices for households became the highest in Europe. People were choosing between heating their homes and paying other bills. The government forecast a recession for 2023. And they weren't wrong. Germany became the only economy in the G7 to contract in 2023. The economy shrank by 0.3% in the fourth quarter, making it the worst-performing major economy globally that year. Now let's talk about what Germany did in response, because this is where you see the desperation of the situation. First, they threw money at the problem. The government presented a €200 billion defense shield in September 2022. This included subsidies for reducing gas and electricity prices, originally projected at €83 billion. They'd already earmarked €95 billion in support funds, spread out in 3 relief programs. They cut petrol taxes. They introduced a €9 flat-rate ticket for public transport. They froze the carbon dioxide price for transport and buildings. Second, they scrambled to find alternative energy sources. Germany went full steam ahead, building import infrastructure for liquefied natural gas. They'd never had their own LNG terminals before because they'd relied on pipelines. Suddenly, they were building them in months. By the end of 2022, the first direct flows of LNG were being fed into the country's gas grid. They made deals with everyone. Norway became their new largest supplier. They signed a $55 billion long-term contract with Norwegian producer Equinor for 111 terawatt-hours of gas annually for 10 years. They strengthened cooperation with China on solar technology. They explored hydrogen collaborations with African nations. Third, and this is where it gets controversial, they brought coal back. Remember all those environmental commitments? They temporarily reactivated coal-fired power plants. The very coal plants they'd been phasing out for climate reasons were suddenly running longer to make up for the gas shortfall. They even kept their last 3 nuclear plants running for an extra 3.5 months until April 15, 2023. That was hugely controversial within the government coalition. The Greens had campaigned for decades on shutting down nuclear power, but the energy crisis was so severe that even they had to compromise. And fourth, the government urged everyone to save energy. Gas consumption in Germany dropped 18% in 2022. That's not just businesses cutting back. That's people keeping their thermostats lower, taking shorter showers, finding any way to reduce energy use. But here's the thing about crises. They don't just reveal problems, they reveal the depth of strategic failures that have been building for years. Germany's energy crisis exposed 3 massive blind spots. First, geopolitical naivety. The German political establishment genuinely believed that economic interdependence would prevent conflict. They thought Putin needed German markets and German money more than he wanted to achieve his geopolitical goals. They were wrong. Multiple German politicians have admitted this now. Wolfgang Schäuble, former finance minister, said flatly, "I was wrong. We were all wrong. We didn't want to see it." He regrets not listening to Poland and the Baltic states, who were right. But Angela Merkel, she's defended her record consistently. She says she has no regrets about the energy policy. She claims she never believed in change through trade in the first place, which is interesting given that her entire policy was built on it. She says, "You always act in the time in which you find yourself," and that she knew Putin wanted to destroy Europe, but thought it was important to maintain trade connections. If you knew he wanted to destroy Europe, why would you make Europe dependent on his energy? That's the question her critics keep asking. From Merkel's perspective, though, She was managing an impossible situation. The German public wanted cheap energy. German industry needed competitive costs. The anti-nuclear movement was powerful. What was she supposed to do? That's a legitimate question, and it shows how democratic pressures can create strategic vulnerabilities. The second blind spot was the conflict between energy security and climate goals. Germany was trying to do everything at once: phase out nuclear, phase out coal, massively expand renewables, maintain industrial competitiveness, keep energy affordable for citizens, and do it all while the renewable technology wasn't quite ready to carry the full load. Something had to give, and what gave was energy security. Natural gas became the bridge fuel, the thing that would fill the gap while renewables scaled up. And that bridge was made in Russia. Now, experts will tell you that even without the Russia dependency, Germany's energy transition was always going to be difficult. Wind and solar are intermittent. The sun doesn't always shine. The wind doesn't always blow. You need either massive energy storage, which Germany was building but not fast enough, or you need dispatchable backup power. Gas was supposed to be that backup. But when you lose 55% of your gas supply overnight, the whole system starts falling apart. Germany's government now says they need 17 to 25 gigawatts of new gas-fired capacity by 2030. The total capacity of currently working gas-fired plants is 33 gigawatts, so they need to nearly double it. And here's the plan. These new gas plants are being marketed as climate-friendly because they're expected to be converted to burn renewable-produced hydrogen at some point in the future. Whether that happens or not remains to be seen. The third blind spot was ignoring warnings, and this one is particularly frustrating because the warnings weren't subtle. Poland was vocal for years about the dangers of Nord Stream 2. The United States repeatedly raised concerns. Eastern European countries that had lived under Soviet domination were practically begging Germany to reconsider. But German politicians, business leaders, and even many German citizens dismissed these warnings. From their perspective, these were geopolitical concerns interfering with sound economic policy. Why should Germany sacrifice its economic interests because of Polish fears or American strategic considerations? There was also an element of, let's be honest, condescension. Germany saw itself as sophisticated, pragmatic, capable of managing complex relationships with authoritarian regimes. The warnings from Eastern Europe were viewed as outdated Cold War thinking. One German diplomat reportedly said they weren't going to let small countries dictate their energy policy. That attitude, that dismissal of legitimate security concerns, that's what a strategic blind spot looks like. Now let's talk about what this means for you. Because even if you don't live in Germany, even if you've never set foot in Europe, this crisis affects your life. First, global energy prices. When Europe scrambles to replace Russian gas, they're competing for liquefied natural gas on the global market. That drives up prices everywhere. American consumers saw higher natural gas prices, partly because of European demand. Second, inflation. Energy prices affect everything. Transportation costs go up, manufacturing costs go up, food prices go up because farming is energy intensive. The inflation wave that hit the United States in 2022 and 2023 wasn't just about pandemic stimulus and supply chains. European energy prices were part of the equation. Third, industrial competition. German companies are relocating. Volkswagen and Mercedes have made significant new investments in the United States. BASF announced layoffs and plant closures. When German industry struggles, global supply chains shift. That creates opportunities in some places, job losses in others. Analysis shows German companies almost tripled their investments in the United States in 2023 to $15.7 billion. Part of that was Biden's Inflation Reduction Act offering subsidies, but part of it was Germany's energy costs making domestic production uncompetitive. Fourth, the renewable energy transition. Germany was supposed to be the model. The Energiewende, the energy transition, was going to show the world how to move from fossil fuels to clean energy. Now that model looks a lot more complicated. Other countries are watching and drawing conclusions. Some are saying we need to keep nuclear power longer. Some are saying we can't rush the transition without ensuring energy security first. Some are saying the German model failed, and we need a different approach. That debate is happening in the United States right now as we figure out our own energy future. So where does Germany go from here? Well, they're adapting, but it's not easy and it's not cheap. By the end of 2023, Russia's share of European gas supply had dropped from over 40% to about 15%. Germany specifically cut its gas imports by 32.6% in 2023. They're building out massive renewable capacity. The target is at least 20 gigawatts of renewable capacity installed annually by 2030. They want 12 gigawatts of energy storage to manage the intermittency of wind and solar. But here's the challenge. Germany is projecting its third consecutive year of recession in 2025. The Handelsblatt Research Institute called it their greatest crisis in post-war history. The economy contracted 0.9% in 2023, then another 0.5% in 2024. The political consequences are significant too. The energy crisis and the economic struggles have boosted support for the far-right Alternative for Germany party, the AfD. They're polling at levels that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. The coalition government that was supposed to lead the energy transition has been fractured by budget crises and election defeats. Some German politicians are even talking about reviving Nord Stream 2 as part of efforts to end the war in Ukraine. There were media reports in early 2025 that talks were happening between US investors and the company that operates Nord Stream for a post-sanctions deal. The outgoing economy minister shut that down pretty quickly, saying it would be completely the wrong direction while Ukraine is still under Russian aggression. But the fact that it's even being discussed tells you how desperate the situation remains. Now let's zoom out and think about the bigger lessons here, because Germany's experience is a case study in strategic thinking and where it can go wrong. Lesson 1. Economic interdependence doesn't necessarily prevent conflict. The whole theory of change through trade assumed that countries won't bite the hand that feeds them. But sometimes they do, especially when they have other goals that matter more than economic prosperity. Russia was willing to sacrifice enormous economic benefits to pursue its geopolitical aims. Germany's market mattered less to Putin than controlling Ukraine. That's not because Putin is irrational, it's because he has different priorities than German policymakers assumed. Lesson 2. Single points of failure are dangerous. When 55% of your energy supply comes from one source, you're vulnerable. It doesn't matter how reliable that source has been historically. If it fails, you're in crisis. Diversification isn't just an economic principle, it's a security principle. You need multiple suppliers, multiple routes, multiple options. Lesson 3. Popular opinion and strategic necessity don't always align. The German public wanted to phase out nuclear power. That was a legitimate democratic choice. But that choice had strategic consequences that weren't fully understood or accepted. Democratic countries face this tension constantly. Sometimes what's popular isn't what's strategic. Sometimes what's strategic isn't what's politically possible. Managing that tension is one of the hardest parts of governance. Lesson 4. Warnings from allies matter. When Poland and the Baltic states were raising concerns about Nord Stream, they weren't just being paranoid. They had historical experience and geographical proximity that gave them insight Germany didn't have. Dismissing those warnings was a mistake. Not every warning will be correct, but when multiple allies with relevant experience are all saying the same thing, you should at least seriously consider their perspective. Lesson 5. Energy security is national security. Germany treated energy as primarily an economic issue. Cheapest source wins. But energy is also a security issue. Can you maintain your economy during a crisis? Can you heat homes in winter? Can you keep factories running? Those aren't just economic questions, they're questions about national sovereignty and resilience. Looking forward, the implications of Germany's energy crisis extend far beyond Germany. For Europe, the question is how to build a more resilient energy system. The European Union is pushing to cut all gas and oil trade with Russia by 2027. That requires massive infrastructure investment, new supply relationships, and faster renewable deployment. For the United States, there are several implications. American LNG exports to Europe have increased dramatically. That's economically beneficial for U.S. producers and strategically beneficial for U.S. influence. But it also ties the U.S. more closely to European energy security. The U.S. is also drawing lessons about its own energy transition. How fast should we move on renewables? Should we be extending the life of nuclear plants or building new ones? How do we balance climate goals with energy security and economic competitiveness? For China, which has been watching this whole situation closely, the lesson might be about the importance of energy independence. China is massively investing in solar, wind, and nuclear. They're also building strategic petroleum reserves and diversifying their energy imports. Germany's crisis reinforces why that matters. For developing countries deciding their energy future, Germany's experience provides both a warning and an opportunity. The warning is don't create dependency. The opportunity is that global energy markets are shifting, creating new demand for alternative suppliers and technologies. There's also a broader question about globalization and interdependence. For decades, the prevailing wisdom was that economic integration makes everyone better off and reduces conflict. The more countries trade with each other, the more they have to lose from war. Germany's crisis, along with the pandemic-era supply chain disruptions, has challenged that wisdom. Maybe economic interdependence needs to be balanced with strategic autonomy. Maybe certain sectors, like energy, food, and critical technologies, need more redundancy and less optimization. That doesn't mean abandoning global trade, but it might mean being more careful about which dependencies you accept and having backup plans for critical systems. The era of just-in-time delivery and single-source suppliers might be giving way to an era of resilience and redundancy. That will probably mean higher costs in normal times, but it might mean better survival in crisis times. Here's what strikes me most about this whole story. Germany didn't fail because of incompetence. They didn't fail because of corruption or stupidity. They failed because of perfectly rational decisions that, in aggregate, created massive vulnerability. Each individual choice made sense at the time. Cheap Russian gas supported German industry and kept energy bills low for citizens. Phasing out nuclear power responded to legitimate public concerns. Building Nord Stream pipelines seemed like smart infrastructure investment. Pursuing change through trade aligned with post-Cold War optimism about integration and cooperation. But those individual rational choices added up to strategic disaster when the underlying assumptions proved wrong. That's what makes this such a fascinating and important case study. You can't just say Germany was foolish or short-sighted. They had reasons for their choices. Those reasons seemed compelling. The business community supported it. Multiple governments across different parties pursued similar policies. What failed was the fundamental assumption that economic logic would override geopolitical conflict. That assumption was wrong. Germany is still one of the world's most sophisticated economies with world-class technology and industry. They'll adapt and survive, but the cost of this crisis, both economic and strategic, is enormous. They're facing their third consecutive year of recession. Industrial competitiveness has been damaged, possibly permanently. Political instability is increasing. Trust in the strategic judgment of German leadership, both domestically and internationally, has been shaken. The question now is whether other countries will learn from Germany's mistakes or repeat them in different forms. Are we creating dependencies on China for critical technologies? Are we assuming economic relationships will prevent conflict when history suggests otherwise? Are we dismissing warnings because they're politically inconvenient? These aren't just German questions. They're universal questions about how to navigate an increasingly complex and unpredictable world. So here's what I want you to think about. What dependencies is your country accepting in exchange for economic efficiency? Where are the blind spots in your nation's strategic planning? What warnings are being dismissed that might turn out to be accurate? Because the lesson of Germany's energy crisis isn't that Germany is uniquely foolish. The lesson is that even sophisticated, well-intentioned countries can make strategic errors when they prioritize short-term economic logic over long-term security considerations. And those errors, once made, can be incredibly costly to reverse. Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Is Germany's crisis a unique situation, or does it reveal broader vulnerabilities in how modern economies operate? What lessons should the United States or other countries draw from this? If you found this video valuable, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into geopolitics and global economics, and share this with anyone who's trying to understand the complexities of energy security and international relations in the 2020s.